Okay, we're going to get started with our next presentation. I'd like to welcome George Fletcher, who's going to talk to us a bit about Mobile Connect and user impacts on the mobile experience. Thank you, George. I'll stand in your way.
All right, awesome. Thank you, John. I don't know. Am I close enough to this mic? Yes. Okay, perfect. So, yes, as John said, my name is George Fletcher. I am the identity architect at AOL. Been involved in the OpenID Foundation for a long time, working on the OpenID Connect protocol and a number of other things. I should say quickly that with Verizon's recent purchase of Yahoo, we're merging together. Our new company name from a B2B perspective is Oath, and no, I was not involved in the decision, and yes, I understand all the conflicts that creates for me in the identity space. I want to talk a little bit about the Mobile Connect user experience and some issues as we've been looking at it that are use cases really that excuse me, as an industry I don't think we've solved yet. So to start that, I want to walk through a little bit of a history. I'll call this my history of user experience from an authentication perspective. So, right, we all started with a username and password sign-on. Every site had its own. We all either reused passwords or maybe if we were lucky had a password manager back in the day, but probably for the most part, maybe if we were being good, identity security people, we'd have 2 or 3 passwords and we'd use, different levels of strength passwords and reuse them, but effectively there was no identity sharing, right? Then SAML came along and we had the in-common federations and our circles of trust and all of the things, right? So this is the beginning of how do I share my identity from one place and use it at another place. And thanks to Ken for giving me a screenshot. I think he said there were hundreds of identity providers on this UI. So go through, find your identity provider. But this is sort of the beginning of being able to share your identity between systems. Well, the social world, wanted to get in on the game, and we started out with OpenID 1. And in reality, OpenID 1 was about how do I protect blog spam on my blog? And since if you had a blog, you knew what the URL of your blog was, this wasn't such a big concept to enter your URL as your login identifier. But obviously for the masses of the internet, that was never going to work, right? So we sort of went from OpenID 1 to OAuth 1 to OAuth 2 to OpenID 2, and we sort of got into this kind of a model, right? Put the best identity providers for your website up on the screen. Sometimes we call this the NASCAR problem, and pick which one you want to log in with, and you go through the flow and you get logged in. This obviously has problems. This doesn't solve Ken's picture, right, of hundreds of providers, or Google's problem of enterprise, supporting hundreds of enterprises or thousands of enterprises, and the login model. So Google did a bunch of research, right, and we ended up with the identifier first flow, right? This is the concept of I type in my login ID, the system behind figures out which identity provider that login ID is associated with, I send them over there, and they get logged in. One of the benefits of this kind of a model is, as Adam showed in the last talk, if you were here, you can basically take passwords out of this completely, right? You can, if you know that that identity provider has a strong authenticator, you can basically use that instead of passwords, and so you don't have to have a password box. Then typing your login ID on a mobile is a pain, so we got to account chooser. Now we're sort of into the world of things that aren't deployed very far. There's not I'd say even the identifier first flow, there's not ubiquitous use of that login flow today. Account chooser even less. Google's done a great job with deploying account chooser. A few other places have. Yahoo has kind of one. There's a few others spread around. But for the most part, there isn't wide adoption of this across the internet. but it does give, especially on a mobile, a much better experience, because what it does is it stores your identities in the local device. So it is a sort of device-specific list of identities. So if you're sharing a laptop or a computer or a phone with somebody else, both of your identities show up in the list. But at least it's what you use, right, on that device, which is much better than the hundreds or thousands that we saw in some of the other UIs. Now, the last one I sort of want to talk about here before I get into Mobile Connect is OpenYOLO, which is an OpenID Foundation working group standing for You Only Log In Once. If you think about account chooser basically stored your login ID and maybe a hint as to who your identity provider is, right? Along with some other miscellaneous attributes like your profile pic. OpenYOLO is about how can you start adding credentials into that kind of a model so that your device has a way to basically also present credentials. And this is just sort of in active work within the OpenID Foundation. So if you're interested in this, there's a bunch of big players involved, including many of the active password managers we use today. Please join the OpenID Foundation and get involved. This is a great experience to be working for our users. So I wanted to set that as a bit of a history and a bit of a stage and context for Mobile Connect. And what is Mobile Connect and how does it sort of work? And then what are the issues that we sort of need to address as an industry? So Mobile Connect is an effort of the GSMA. There's a link there. You can go look it up. They have a developer program. There's an OpenID Foundation working group called Moderna that is basically defining protocols for the Mobile Connect effort. What it's really trying to do is use your phone number as your user identifier, use the phone as the authenticator, and allow the MNO to be the IDP, right? And if you think about it, I'll explain here in a minute how we can replace passwords and existing hardware tokens. But this is sort of the crux of Mobile Connect. So sort of, how does it work? Basically, and I probably can get the demo to work. It just didn't look very good because I'm using the Mobile Connect IO sandbox. If you find me at lunch, I can probably get it working. I had it working before I came out to the conference. But here's sort of the flow. You go to some relying party. Oh, I should make a note. Service provider is sort of SAML speak. Relying party or client is OpenID Connect / OAuth2 speak. So, you know, if you're not familiar with SAML, just replace service provider with relying party or client, and this will probably make sense. So you go to some website on your browser or mobile phone, and you basically click, sign in with your mobile number. And what that's there's a number of ways that this can happen, but effectively, I'll just choose one to talk about today. The relying party is going to redirect you to this API exchange or discovery server. And the reason for that is more from a privacy perspective. You may not want to give your phone number to that relying party. So this is an additional discovery spec that's been defined. You send them over to the discovery service or the API exchange. The user enters their phone number. The API exchange figures out who the MNO is for that user and basically redirects you back to your relying parties, right? So there's one browser redirect. Go over, enter my phone number, come back. Now the relying party knows who the identity provider is for the flow. At that point, then the relying party just starts OpenID Connect flow with the IDP. So, so you get your second redirect from the relying party to the MNO, mobile network operator, and you're just doing OpenID Connect. There are some, the Moderna spec adds some specific profiles around OpenID Connect, but suffice it to say it's an OpenID Connect flow, right? At that point, the MNO can choose whatever mechanism it needs to authenticate you via your device. So, if you want to think about this, right? The way a user authenticates on their device could be, because the MNO owns the device, right, it could push a prompt to your phone that says, you know, scan your fingerprint or take a picture. And at that point, right, you have both something you have, the phone, and something you are, right, your fingerprint or your facial recognition or any of the other factors that Mike and Adam were talking about in the previous talk to authenticate you. So effectively, you get multi-factor authentication, right, with no password, right? The MNO, when they authenticated you successfully, redirects you back to the relying party with a code. You exchange your code for tokens. Now you've got access tokens. The user's logged in. You can call the user info endpoint and all of that. So that's basically the flow. Obviously, there's, we'll look at it from sort of two perspectives, right? From the relying party perspective, after the user clicks the Mobile Connect button, I've got to discover their MNO, all right? I may be able to cache that in the device at some point. But, you know, the caching and the device perspective is there. So you might be able to skip discovery at some point in the future based on cache. You just probably need to check it periodically because people can port their numbers. Right? I find the MNO, I do an OpenID Connect flow, and now I can get customer data. The benefit of having the user give their mobile number to the discovery service is that they can then potentially choose in the consent flow of OpenID Connect to not share their mobile number with the relying party. From the user perspective, right, it's click Mobile Connect, enter your phone number. Hopefully that part can get cached in some way so you don't have to do it every time. Right, some level of consent. If this is a new relying party, you're going to do the authentication, the website refreshes, and you're logged in. So that's sort of just ground set for how Mobile Connect works. So hopefully that part's clear. So what happens here? So a couple of things. If you think about social logins today, if you're already logged into Google, right, and the site you're going to is using account chooser or happens to know your Google email address anyway already, and all you want to know about this user is, are they logged in, and is this the email address of who's logged in, right? You basically hit the sign in with Google button, and you're logged into the website. One click, right? Because Google, Andy, you can, you know, correct me if I'm a mistake, but basically if the relying party already knows your email address and you send it over to Google and you're logged in with that email address already, they're not sharing anything that the relying party doesn't know. So effectively you get back with no consent. So if you're asking for a lot of other things, then you're going to have to get consent, right? If your relying party wants to access Gmail or other data, then you'll have the consent step. There's a couple of extra steps in Mobile Connect. I think that's something we're going to need to work on from a Mobile Connect perspective. But we do gain MFA and you know, effectively a second factor login without passwords, and there is a lot of value for that. So I have a question. How many people have more than one Gmail account, or basically more than one email account at a given provider? All right. How many people have the same number of mobile numbers as you have email accounts at that given provider? So how many, all right, Rajiv, how many accounts do you have and how many mobile numbers do you have? 3 and 3. Okay. Those are virtual phone numbers. All right, so it's not like a real phone number. You're going to have a harder time trying to potentially do some of the MFA kinds of things. I think really, and we're going to go into these in detail, but this sort of resolves into 3 kinds of areas that we as an industry, if we're looking at adopting Mobile Connect for our relying party sites, need to address. One of them is account linking. This is sort of known, but you don't see a ton of sites doing it. One of them is this issue of basically identifier to RP account mismatch, right? We have a one-to-many relationship in most cases. And then this, a concept I sort of want to bring up that I'm calling personas to try and potentially look at this from an IDP perspective. So account linking is kind of an interesting scenario, right? If you think about as a relying party, you have a bunch of existing users who use your site, and you want to add Mobile Connect to your site, right? When that user comes to you via Mobile Connect, and you have an ID token with some subject identifier in it, you have to either figure out, how do I match that against my existing user base, or how do I ask the user, do you have an existing account? And then if you have an existing account, how do you authenticate to that account to prove that you own it so that you can link it, right? Now, as most of us have multiple Gmail accounts, let's say, and one mobile number, what does that mean? Where do I go to say, okay, I want to link this one mobile number with these 3 Gmail accounts, right? So at some level, there needs to be account management UI around linking, right? And that's something that I don't think that we have good best practice for from an industry. Same basic flow in this particular case, right? But if I've linked it to one account and I come back, but I have 3 accounts at Google, right? How do I ever get it to link to the others? Or if I have, via some account management mechanism, linked it to 3 Google accounts, then the relying party needs to present some UI effectively saying, who do you want to be today, right? And if you think that the Gmail account or whatever is a use case that is maybe, not so applicable, think about a small business where that small business owner has both a personal account and a business account at the same bank, right? And they potentially have 2 Visa cards, right? But they end up just using their mobile number for both personal and business, right? You're going to have that one-to-many mismatch. So if you think about it, there's sort of 2 ways to kind of address this. One of them is to push all the logic on the relying party, right? All this account management UI, that basically says I can link to multiple, I ask you which one you want to be, maybe you can pick some defaults, maybe you have a user switcher like Google has, right? If I log into multiple accounts at the same time with Google, right? But what if we could solve it at the IDP? So what if when I got to the MNO, right, it basically said, what persona do you want to be today? Or maybe allow me to create as many personas as I want, right? And then I can map them to as many accounts as I have at the relying party, right? That way, the relying party basically gets a unique identifier for each of the personas, even though I'm only using a single number to actually do the login. This does basically also, where the phone number, if the relying party were to get the phone number could be a global correlating, identifier. This persona model would actually allow you to effectively give pairwise pseudonymous identifiers for each persona and stop correlation, both within the relying party itself as well as across relying parties. Now, within the relying party is probably not too accurate because you start looking at IP addresses and browser fingerprints or app fingerprints or HTTP API call fingerprints and other stuff, and they will probably pretty quickly figure out that all of these personas are coming from the same device or the same location. So, the benefits of using something like a persona model is that the relying party doesn't have to deal with the logic. We can sort of centralize it in the MNOs. Most of the time, we try and put complexity in the smaller number of services. So that's your IDPs. The problem with Mobile Connect and something like this is that number portability is already hard with Mobile Connect. The OpenID Connect working group, Moderna working group, has defined some specifications for how when you move your phone number from one carrier to another carrier, that all of your identifiers that the first carrier generated for you show up at the next carrier so you don't lose your accounts. Obviously, if you have personas, you sort of got to do that in much greater detail. So in conclusion, basically, we've got account linking. That is something that most relying parties don't do today. We've got this new user experience of the one-to-many case, and maybe this idea of something like personas to help with some of these issues. And I'm definitely interested in questions and feedback. Thank you very much.
Thanks, George. Questions from the audience?
I've been wondering about the discovery service. Is there one global discovery service, or are there local discovery services? How does that work?
John may be able to better answer this than I am, but I suspect there's a small number of discovery services.
So in the Moderna specs, there is a specification for discovery services. The problem is that the actual lookup from a phone number to who the MNO is a paid-for service. There is a commercial database run by somebody for the GSMA. So the GSMA is going to run a service and basically eat the cost to some amount. Now, there's nothing that stops an individual carrier, so Deutsche Telekom or somebody else may also run an equivalent discovery service. So if you were a relying party and you had a relationship with a particular carrier, you may either use the central GSMA provided discovery service or the carrier's discovery service.
So it's a two-part question. The first one was regarding the authentication on the MNO side. Probably I missed it, but are they using the 4G authentication at all to verify the identity, or that's not part of the spec at all, and authentication is left out? That's one. And the second is, I guess along the same lines, is how do the economics break down of this? Like, where's the money, and in the sense like who pays for these things? Should the relying party pay for it? So what's the model there?
Yes, George.
So the first one, right, OpenID Connect is, as you heard from Adam if you were here in the first talk, is sort of silent on how authentication happens. So there's no spec standard for how you have to authenticate. The MNO is sort of able to use whatever mechanisms they want to securely authenticate the user at the sort of level of assurance or trust that's requested by the relying party in the OpenID Connect flow. As to the business model and the economics, I really can't comment on that. I was looking at it from a user experience side of things, not so much the program as a whole and the business model.
So, it's left to the individual carriers, and some carriers are using header enrichment, GBA. There's SMSs to the, class 2 SMSs to the SIM. There's a bunch of different ways. Some are including a smart app, which uses part of FIDO UAF. So there's a number. It's up to the individual carrier, and they're providing authentication context back to whoever the relying party is to give an indication. So they may have premium authentication, which is a charged for service for banks and other people, plus premium attributes, etc. The base service is intended to be free for basic identity and basic authentication. If you want more, they're a telephone company and they will figure out how to charge you for it.
Yeah, one challenge in Mobile Connect is the adaptation rate at the service provider side. Like if you take India, so all the MNOs do support Mobile Connect, and it's available for more than 900 million users. But there are only very few service providers. So even Sri Lanka, so we have the largest mobile network operators. They do support Mobile Connect, but there are 2-3 service providers. So how do you think this going?
So, in these ecosystems, right, there is always a bootstrapping problem, and to some extent being the IDP is easier than being the relying party. I think the issue is that there are real issues as a relying party when you're doing federation, right? Not just the ones I talked about today. There are other ones in the sense of if you're a pay-for service, right, and the IDP is down, what does that mean for your user, right? Or if all you have to identify the user is potentially a random unique identifier for that user and some maybe non-unique first name, last name, right? How do you find the user if they call up your customer support center, or online chat and say, hey, I need to find you? So I think the issue is that we haven't done a good job from an industry perspective in defining best practices around some of these more maybe they're edge cases, but some of these use cases within the relying party. And there isn't like the go grab that Ruby gem and drop it in my code, and it does all this stuff for me, right? As it relates to, we've done federated authentication. We haven't done federated lifecycle management, right? In the sense of open source code that you can just plug in. And I think if we had that, we would see a lot more relying parties take advantage of it. But if they've got to go build all of that stuff, maybe it's just as easy to add their own username password. So I think, you know, when they will support it, or if they will support it, or how they will do something similar, I think is a great question. I don't really have any direct insight into that aspect of it.
There is an NSTIC pilot which Verizon and the other North American MNOs are participating in, and they all have secret plans which haven't been announced yet, and they would kill me if I divulged.
Yes.
So it's not, while the North American MNOs are the most retarded of the bunch, they are aware of what's going on.
I think that's it, time-wise.
I had a question on authentication, how MNOs authenticate the users. So part of that has been answered by you. As a follow-up on that, are you also considering, or have you considered the case where there's an applet on the UICC or the SIM inside the phone? And if so, I mean, that applet has to get there somehow, and what are the plans to get it there?
You want me to take that, George?
Sure.
So I have, so depends on the carrier. Some of the carriers have been doing that. Of course, distributing applets in situ over SMS has proven to be a challenge to many an operator not wanting to completely tank their network. So Deutsche Telekom has a very small SIM applet that they can do an over-the-air update with. Other operators are doing SIM swaps to do that. So it really depends on the operator. Some are relying on applets in the SIM, especially in places where they're feature phones rather than smartphones. Other places they're looking more at smart applications which are authenticated and then can use IP-based authentication such as a FIDO assertion, because a lot of people roam onto Wi-Fi and other things. So it depends on the carrier and some of the use cases and how they're dealing with their SIM infrastructure.
This is Rajiv Dalakia, Knock Knock Labs. So I think a couple of clarifications that might help in context of some of the questions. First, the Mobile Connect is a standardization activity at the GSM.
Both.
It's both, right? Yes. So there are a set of specifications, and you can go access them, et cetera. Second, I think in the context of authentication, as George said, there isn't a prescription towards a particular method of authentication, but a good way to think about it is that there are network-oriented authenticators, and there are non-network-oriented authenticators. And both GSMA and the FIDO Alliance have been working together. There's a couple of white papers associated with what you can do with the use of FIDO as a mechanism to do the authentication under the Mobile Connect framework. The third, the NSTIC pilot that John mentioned was demonstrated at the last Mobile World Congress. And if you look at it, it'll give you a sense of some of the potential for what Mobile Connect does, particularly in relation to some of the attributes that can be held and divulged at the user's consent. I think the example that they showed was a user walking up to a beverage machine that's dispensing some alcoholic beverage and requires an assertion that the user is over 18. So the user, authenticates into one of these identity providers, and there's an assertion made that this person's over 18. The authentication method could be a fingerprint sensor or a PIN or whatever it is that's been set up there. So I think it's an interesting system. There's probably different geos are moving at different paces. It's probably safe to say, and whether the North American ones arrive, whether there's a business model or not, I think all of that's still open for discussion.
I think we're probably out of time, John.
Yeah,
Next
so
one starts in 15:05.
thank you, George.